What's up, YouTube? So today we are looking at a really awesome new synth plugin called Modus by Physical Audio. So imagine having a plate reverb, but being able to send it the direct oscillator signal and basically use it as its own oscillator source. That's essentially what the idea behind Modus is. So there are several modes like plates and strings and then a combination of those. But anyway, today's video, I'm going to dive into the wonderful world of Modus by Physical Audio. So before we dive in, just the full disclosure, this is a sponsored video thanks to the folks over at Physical Audio. That being said, I truly think this is a very unique plugin and I've had a lot of fun diving into it for the past few days. Whether or not you think my opinion is biased, I'm going to kind of just try stick to showing you the features and then you can kind of imagine it in your own workflow. Anyway, without blabbering too much, let's dive in and have a look. So of course this plugin is pretty different to the regular synth plugins that we probably know. It doesn't have a traditional oscillator with basic shapes and traditional filter and that kind of thing. It's derived around a completely different synth engine. So bear in mind, these sounds that you're hearing are not samples or a multi-sample library or anything like that. It is completely synthesized within the plugin. And you use various different parameters to kind of like change how the sounds are synthesized. It might be a little bit confusing at first, however, that being said, it is still very intuitive and easy to use, especially for those who might not know about physical modeling synthesis. It kind of makes it a lot easier. So I'm going to run through a bunch of the features and parameters and then some sound examples. So basically there are three synthesis modes. There is strings mode, strings and plate mode, and plates mode. Each one has individual characteristics as to how you can synthesize the sound, and they vary in, how you could use it in context. For example, the plates mode is more of a monophonic style mode. The string plate is a duophonic style oscillator, and the strings is a polyphonic style oscillator. So obviously the resonant tails from each of the strings are polyphonic, whereas in the plates mode, there is just one plate that's resonating. So each note affects that resonance, if that kind of makes sense. So anyway, each of these synth modes has individual settings that you can dial in over here on the left-hand side. And then you have various global controls, such as modulations, how it strikes the sound here. So you can do a thing that's kind of more rhythmic or single melodic patterns. And then you have a global mixer and some effects like a filter, delay, and reverb. These settings, the global and the effects, all stay the same when you switch between the modes. Of course, there are different things that you can dial in on the mixer itself. For example, with the strings, you can mix in each of the strings individually, whereas with the plates, you can mix the driver itself as well as each of the plates. So you have individual mix parameters for each one, which I think is pretty interesting. So you can get some pretty diverse sounds out of this pretty simple interface. So I'm going to start with the strings oscillator, and we can have a look at some of the parameters that you can dial in over here. So essentially the idea of the string oscillator is the first string is determined by the chromatic pitch input of the synth, and the second, third, and fourth, or depending on how many you set up, you can have just two. All the other strings are essentially resonant strings. So those don't get plucked by the input, but you can tune them individually. So this is really interesting for either like harmonic bell-like sounds or inharmonic bell-like sounds and getting really interesting tones that way. Each of the strings can be tuned to something that's more like a metallic sound, or whether it's a kind of resonant string sound, or actually anywhere in between, which is really interesting. Each one has various damping and tone controls. And then, like I said, with the second, third, and fourth strings, if you have those enabled, you can actually dial in the mass ratio. It's the mass of the string against the first string. So, for example, if the mass ratio is 50%, then the second string has a mass of 50% of the first string. So there's all these kind of weird physical modeling like characteristics which you can dial in that would be incredibly difficult to synthesize with a traditional synthesizer. But I guess at the end of the day, the concepts are very similar. It's still using sine waves and all that kind of stuff to generate most of these parameters. It's just a very intuitive way of doing it. And then along the bottom here, you have a global position setting over here, and then you have the envelope settings over here. So what the position is basically kind of like a mic placement emulator. What you're essentially doing is controlling where it's picking up the sound and where it's plucking the sound. You can see this is actually like the little shape of a plectrum. So where on the string the pluck is happening and where on the string the pickup is happening. And you can actually invert them and do all sorts of interesting things like that. So you see here, for example, like I was saying, where string 1 is the kind of exciter string, string 2 are the resonator strings, and then you have individual control here of each one on the mixer. So you can kind of dial in just the pluck of the sound or just the kind of reverberant texture of the strings or of the plates or whatever your settings are. So you can get some really interesting tones and textures this way that are, I guess, kind of very difficult to do with traditional subtractive synthesis. Okay, so I quickly want to talk about something in the global parameters, and then we can have a look at some of the other synth modes. So the connections system over here. This is pretty interesting because as you see here, I've dialed in the third and the fourth string, but I'm not getting anything on the mix here. And that's because if you look at the picture, not all of these strings are connected. So the connection system basically governs how each of the strings is connected and the physical characteristics of those connections. So how strong it is and how much of a gap there is between them and that kind of stuff. And then you have various different maps. So these are how the strings are basically configured in physical space. And we can actually choose whether they're decoupled or coupled. So for example, here you can see these strings are decoupled and here they're all connected. And then we can choose different maps here. So I believe these govern how string 3 and string 4 are actually connected into the mix. So the stretch parameter basically governs how the harmonics are stretched over the frequency spectrum. Okay, so let's have a look at the plates mode. For those who don't know how a plate reverb works, essentially, well, the kind of physical plate reverbs from back in the day, it was essentially a big piece of metal with a speaker driver attached to it and a transducer or tiny microphone attached to the other side. The speaker driver would play a sound, and then the microphone or the transducer would pick up the vibrations on the metal plate. That's essentially how they created plate reverb. Here, you can do a very similar thing where you're using the speaker driver either as a oscillator source, like a saw wave, a sine wave, or you could just strike it to create like weird percussive stuff. Then over here, we have the ability to choose where in the 2D space, like where on the piece of metal, the driver actually hits the piece of metal. And then here we have stereo microphones, which we can choose, where to place on the XY axis of this metal plate. And then we have physical characteristics of the metal plate itself. So this is really interesting, more for textural stuff and for percussive stuff, but you can get some really, really cool, more organic ambient stuff this way. So in strike mode, it automatically enables this multi-strike thing. And what happens here is when you hold the key down, it basically just keeps percussing, can sync it to a rate. But this is really cool for creating these kind of like velocity sensitive percussive things by just modulating this force parameter. But you can also set it to saw waves or sine waves and get more of a kind of synth characteristic out of it. So again, this is really cool for textural atmosphere stuff. And the last synth mode is strings and plate, which is essentially a mix of the two. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of this, but know that you have essentially the ability to edit the strings and edit the plates. So it's very similar here, except we don't have the oscillator to excite the plate. The string is what resonates the plate. So here we don't have the ability to kind of choose where it is on the physical space. We don't have the ability to do those kind of more in-depth details and tunings and things, but it's because it's resonating from the string model. So it's taking the pitch from here. Okay, so the modulation system is a little bit limited. It only allows us to send the LFO1 to very predefined parameters and LFO2 to very predefined parameters. That being said, if you have a DAW like Bitwig, it negates that whole thing, because here, for example, we can just modulate this with modulators within the DAW. So here, for example, if we type inpos, we have inpos X and inpos Y, and we can basically just send randoms to these, and then we can just modulate both of these parameters, and it'll update live within the plugin. So you can see here, it's busy modulating that parameter. We don't actually have to use the plugin's built-in LFO. So most of the time nowadays, these kind of limited modulation stuff within plugins doesn't hit me as hard as it used to in other DAWs, but it would be nice just to see a little bit extra built in over here. We've also got a pretty neat randomize system over here. So that basically just randomizes most of the parameters on the synthesis side of things over here, which is pretty cool. You can actually jump back to the previous random, like an undo, but there isn't undo for any of the other parameters, I don't think. And I believe this button over here basically just kills any feedback that's currently happening on the oscillator side of things. So if you have a thing which is, creating infinite feedback, you can just hit that and it should just kill the feedback. So a few other things to note: it does have MPE capabilities and a global EQ that you can dial in like this, a low shelf and a high shelf, just to kind of fine tune the sound. Awesome. That's about it for today, folks. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. Again, a huge thanks to the folks over at Physical Audio for making this video happen. And yeah, you for watching it. If you do want to support what I do here, check out my Patreon. There's a link in the description. Otherwise, you could check out some of the stuff on my Shopify store. Anyway, see you guys next time. Cheers.